The wind howled across the barren prairie, biting and sharp as it swept over the frost-kissed earth. The sky hung heavy, painted in dull grays, while the land below seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, untouched and alone. Levi Boone stood at the edge of the dirt road, boots planted firm against the cold, his eyes scanning the horizon like he'd done 1,000 times before. He was a man used to solitude, the kind of quiet that settled deep into your bones. His wide-brimmed hat shaded his weathered face, and his hands, rough from years of hard work, gripped the reins of the horse like they'd never let go. In front of him, the town of Sweet Vale stood as a mere smudge on the horizon, its simple buildings hardly more than silhouettes against the backdrop of endless sky. Levi didn't look back at it. He didn't need to. The people in town knew him, and he knew them, an unspoken agreement of mutual distance, a peace in leaving one another alone. But today was different. Today, the wind carried something new, something he hadn't expected. The scent of dust and wildflowers mixed with the sharp sting of the air. And then there she was, a woman, not a native of Sweet Vale. That much was clear. She stood by the edge of the town, her dark hair tied back in a loose braid, her eyes sharp and wary. She wasn't like the women Levi had known all his life. There was something untamed about her, like the land itself, something that drew the eye and made a man wonder what it would be like to step in her world, even for just a moment. Levi had seen strangers before, but none like her. There was a quiet strength in the way she stood, hands on her hips, eyes scanning the same endless horizon he had spent so many years staring at. But she didn't seem like someone who would let the land swallow her up like the rest of them. No, she had a fire in her, a spark that Levi hadn't seen in anyone for years. She looked at him then, her gaze locking with his. The tension in the air shifted. Levi's heart kicked in his chest, but he quickly smothered the feeling. He had learned long ago to ignore such things. Attraction, curiosity, hope. All things better left buried beneath the cold weight of hard work and duty. "What are you doing here?" Levi asked, his voice rough from disuse. She tilted her head slightly, as though studying him. "I'm looking for someone," she replied, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of something Levi couldn't quite place. "Someone who knows this land." Levi didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to make of her words. Everyone in Sweet Vale knew the land. It was harsh, unforgiving, and yet it had a way of teaching you everything you needed to survive. And survive was all Levi knew how to do. "You found him," he said, his voice clipped. "This land doesn't keep secrets. It tells you everything you need to know." She seemed to consider his words for a moment before taking a step closer. "Not everything," she said softly, more to herself than to him. For the first time, Levi let his gaze soften. There was something about her, her presence, the way she didn't shy away from meeting his eyes, that unsettled him. Women didn't look at him like that. No one did. Levi wasn't a man who liked to be looked at, especially not by someone who carried so much of her own story. But something in her voice, her quiet strength, stirred something in him. It made him want to turn away, but he didn't. "I'm not the one you're looking for," he said, trying to put some distance between them. "You'd be better off asking someone else." She didn't argue. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him, her eyes full of questions. Levi could feel the weight of her gaze, the quiet pull of her, and for a moment, he wondered if he was wrong to try and push her away. The wind shifted again, this time carrying with it the faintest scent of something sweeter, like a reminder of something lost. Levi's chest tightened. He didn't know what it was, but it felt like a part of him had been waiting for this moment. The old man inside him, the one who had buried everything he once cared about, felt a stirring. "Well, you're here now," Levi muttered, as if to himself, "and I reckon you'll stay. But just know this, the prairie doesn't give up its secrets easily." She smiled then, a small, knowing smile, and Levi felt a sudden heat rush through his face. It was the kind of smile that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. It caught him off guard, and before he could stop himself, he found himself speaking again, more to fill the silence than anything else. "You've got no idea what you're walking into," he said. "This place, it'll chew you up if you're not careful." She nodded slowly, the wind tugging at the edges of her coat. "Maybe that's why I came," she replied quietly, stepping toward him, her boots crunching on the snow-covered earth. "To see if I'm strong enough to stand it." Levi looked at her for a long moment, his chest tight with a mix of admiration and caution. This woman, this stranger, had no idea what she was getting into. And yet, something in her eyes told him that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she seemed. The wind howled again, but this time, Levi didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, wondering how long it would be before he could stop running for what he felt in his chest. And he knew, somehow, that this woman, this stranger, would be the one to make him face it. The days that followed felt like something out of a dream, a strange, quiet dream that Levi couldn't seem to shake. Every time he stepped out of his cabin, there she was, the woman who had come to Sweet Vale with nothing but her courage and the desire to find something or someone she wasn't sure of yet. Her presence lingered like a shadow in the corner of his mind, always just out of reach, but never gone. Her name was Emma, though Levi had learned that only after a few more quiet exchanges. She didn't share much about herself, and neither did he. But there was something in her eyes, something in the way she looked at him that made him feel exposed, like she could see through the walls he'd carefully built around himself. He wasn't used to that. Levi Boone was a man of few words, but she had a way of making silence feel like a conversation. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the land, Levi stood by his barn, working with the horses. His hands, though skilled and strong, moved mechanically as he groomed the animals. His thoughts were elsewhere, distracted by the nagging feeling that he couldn't shake. That feeling had a name now, Emma. She was standing by the fence, watching him. She didn't say anything, just stood there, her eyes on him, like she was waiting for him to notice. And he did. Of course, he did. He couldn't help but notice her. But he refused to acknowledge it, turning back to the horses, hoping the distraction would pull him from the odd pull she had on him. Finally, she spoke, her voice as steady as always. "You've been at this all day, Levi. Don't you ever rest?" Levi straightened, his back stiff from the work, and turned to face her. She was standing closer now, just on the other side of the fence, her face half lit by the fading sunlight. He hadn't heard her come up, but she was there, steady and unwavering. There was something in her gaze, a quiet confidence that unsettled him. He had learned long ago to trust in silence, to trust in his own distance. But Emma, she was different. She didn't demand anything from him, but she also didn't back away. "I rest when I need to," he said, his voice low, almost gruff. "But the work here doesn't stop. Not for anything." Her lips curved into a small smile, but she didn't laugh. Instead, she nodded as if she understood. "I think you've been running long enough, Levi." His heart skipped a beat, and he looked away, trying to hide the sudden surge of emotion that rushed through him. She was right, of course. He had been running from everything. From the pain, from the past, from the fear of opening up again. He hadn't realized it until now, until she had said it so plainly. "I'm not running," he muttered, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He knew she could see right through him, and that scared him more than anything else. She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped closer to the fence, her hand resting lightly on the weathered wood. "Maybe not physically, but you've built a wall around yourself, Levi. I can see it. I've known people like you before." He gritted his teeth, his fists clenching at his sides. He didn't like where this conversation was going. He didn't like that she could see the truth so clearly. The truth he'd worked so hard to bury. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice sharp now. "And what do you want me to do about it? You think you could just waltz in here and fix me?" Her gaze softened, and for the first time, he saw something other than defiance in her eyes. There was understanding there, compassion, maybe even a little bit of pity, but she didn't offer him false comfort. She didn't need to. Emma was a woman who knew what it was like to live with her own scars. "I don't want to fix you," she said quietly. "I just want you to see that you're not as alone as you think. You don't have to do it all by yourself, Levi. You've been carrying all this weight for so long, but you don't have to do it alone anymore." Levi stared at her for a long moment, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to someone seeing him, truly seeing him, and still choosing to stand there, to not turn away. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "You could have left this place by now. You don't belong here." Emma met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here because I'm looking for something. Maybe not what I expected, but I'm not running either." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Levi didn't know what to say. He had spent his life pushing people away, keeping them at arm's length, afraid of the pain that would come if he let anyone close. But with Emma, it felt different. It felt like there was something worth fighting for, something worth letting in. And yet, the walls he'd built, the ones that had kept him safe for so long, seemed too high to scale. "You think I need saving?" he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. "I don't need anyone's help." "No," she said softly, "but maybe you need someone who will stand with you, even when you don't want them to. Someone who will give you a reason to stay." Levi looked away, his jaw tightening. She was right, and that made it all the harder to face her. He hadn't wanted anyone to get close. He hadn't wanted anyone to see him for who he really was, all the mistakes and regrets, the scars that ran deeper than the ones on his skin. But as Emma stood there, watching him with that quiet strength in her eyes, something in him cracked. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he couldn't keep pretending that he didn't feel it. The pull between them was undeniable, and no matter how much he fought it, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was where he was meant to be. "You're stubborn," she said with a hint of a smile, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "Guess I am," Levi muttered, though he couldn't help but smile back. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like something was broken. It felt like maybe, just maybe, he could start to put the pieces back together. Levi had always prided himself on being a man of few words, but Emma's presence in Sweet Vale seemed to make silence all the harder to come by. He couldn't escape the feeling that something had shifted, something big. Every time he passed her by or found her standing just outside his cabin, her gaze followed him like an unspoken question, pulling at the edges of his resistance. The walls he'd built around himself, thick and high as they were, began to feel flimsy under the weight of her quiet insistence. But Levi wasn't ready to admit that to himself. Not yet. Not after all these years of living alone, of fighting his battles by keeping others at arm's length. He had built a life for himself in Sweet Vale, and though it was a lonely one, it was a life that worked. Or so he thought. The tipping point came on a cold evening, when the sun had slipped behind the hills and a blanket of darkness covered the prairie. Levi had just finished splitting wood by the barn when he heard the faintest sound, like the rustle of footsteps on snow. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. He didn't even need to ask. Emma stood in the doorway of his cabin, her face half shadowed by the dim light inside. She was wearing that same quiet expression, the one that had come to define her. A mix of determination and uncertainty, as if she knew what she wanted but wasn't sure how to take it. Levi wiped his hands on his pants and made his way over to her, each step slow and deliberate. "Thought you'd gone back into town," he said, his voice rough from the day's work. Emma didn't immediately answer. She just stood there, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something. Levi's heart beat a little faster, though he couldn't say why. Was it her proximity? Or was it the unspoken question in her gaze? The one that seemed to ask, "Why are you fighting this?" "I can't go back," she said, her voice steady, but carrying an edge of vulnerability that Levi hadn't heard before. "Not until I know what I'm supposed to be doing here. Not until I know what I'm supposed to be doing with you." Levi froze, his chest tightening. The words caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to this, used to someone showing up and asking him to explain himself, to reveal the things he'd buried deep down. His first instinct was to shut it down, to brush her off and retreat into his familiar, isolated world. But something inside him wouldn't let him. "You don't need to know everything," he finally said, though his words felt weak even to him. "Not here. Not now." Emma shook her head slightly, her breath visible in the cold night air. "But I don't need to know, Levi. I need to know if this," she gestured between them, her hand trembling just slightly, "is real, or if you're just going to keep pushing me away until there's nothing left." Her words hit him harder than he anticipated, and for the first time, Levi felt something shift inside him. The ice that had always been between them, the distance he'd kept to protect himself, felt like it was beginning to crack. She wasn't asking for anything unreasonable. She was asking for him to stop running, to stop hiding. Levi stepped back, his mind racing. He didn't know what to say or even what to feel. All he knew was that the woman in front of him was no longer the stranger who had wandered into town. She was someone who had fought her own battles, just like he had, and maybe, just maybe, they could face them together. "Emma, you don't know what it's like," Levi said, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't been willing to show. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything you've ever loved, to have it all taken from you in an instant. You don't know how that changes a man, how it makes him think he's better off alone." She met his gaze, her eyes soft but unyielding. "I may not know what it's like to lose someone like you've lost, but I do know what it's like to feel like you're invisible, to feel like nothing you do will ever be enough. But I also know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, not unless you make me." Her words echoed in the cold night air, and for the first time, Levi didn't know what to say. The silence between them stretched, long and heavy, until he could feel the weight of it deep in his chest. He took a step toward her, his heart pounding in his ears. The space between them felt impossibly small, and yet it seemed like there was an entire lifetime standing in the way. He hadn't been prepared for this. Not for the way she made him feel, not for the way she challenged everything he believed about love and loss. But now that she was here, now that she was standing in front of him, he realized something he had been too scared to admit. He didn't want to let her go. "Not now, not ever." "I'm not asking for much, Levi," Emma said quietly, as if sensing his internal struggle. "I just want to know if you're ready to stop running, if you're ready to let someone in." Levi swallowed hard, his throat dry. For a moment, he thought about pushing her away again, about sending her back into town, where she could live her life free from the weight of his past. But as he looked into her eyes, something inside him told him that this was different, that maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to help him rebuild everything he had lost. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try." Emma's expression softened, and for the first time, Levi saw something other than the quiet resolve she always wore. He saw hope. "You don't have to do it alone, Levi," she said, stepping closer, her hand gently brushing against his. "You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders anymore." Levi looked down at her hand, then back in her eyes. There, in the quiet of the night, with the wind whispering through the trees and the land stretched out before him, he knew he had to make a choice. He couldn't keep running for what he felt. Not anymore. "I'm not sure what comes next," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But I'm willing to find out." Emma smiled softly, and for the first time since he'd met her, Levi felt like he was standing on solid ground. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Levi had never been a man to make hasty decisions, but with Emma's quiet insistence, he found himself at a crossroads. The walls he'd built around himself, walls that had kept him safe and alone for so long, now seemed like they were crumbling with every conversation, every glance exchanged with her. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was heavy, filled with questions that neither of them could voice. Levi woke up early the next morning, the familiar weight of the day ahead pressing down on him like it always did. But today it felt different. As the sun slowly rose over the land, casting long shadows across the barren fields, Levi couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. His morning routine was the same as always. He fed the horses, split wood for the fire, and checked the fence. But his thoughts were preoccupied, drifting back to the night before when Emma had asked him if he was ready to stop running. She hadn't asked for much. She had simply wanted to know if he was willing to open himself up to her, to the possibility of a future that didn't involve the same lonely, solitary life he'd grown accustomed to. As he worked, Levi found himself glancing toward the cabin more often than usual. He couldn't help it. Emma was there, waiting for him to make a decision that he hadn't been sure he could make. The weight of her presence was both comforting and terrifying, but was also a constant reminder that change was inevitable, and that change had the power to either break him or rebuild him. He wasn't sure which it would be, but he was about to find out. The sound of approaching hooves broke his concentration, and Levi turned just in time to see Emma riding up on horseback, her dark hair flowing behind her like a banner in the wind. She looked like she belonged here in this vast, untamed land, her confidence and strength matching the rugged beauty of the prairie. As she dismounted, Levi felt a knot tighten in his chest. She was here again, and this time the questions were no longer buried in silence. He could feel the tension in the air between them, the unspoken words that neither of them had been willing to say until now. "You've been avoiding me," Emma said softly, her voice carrying an edge of uncertainty that Levi wasn't used to hearing. "You've been quiet, too quiet." Levi hesitated, his hands resting on the axe he had just put down. He didn't know how to respond. The truth was, he had been avoiding her, avoiding the decision he knew he had to make. But what did it mean to make a decision? To choose a life with her? To let her into a place in his heart that he had carefully locked away for so long? "I'm not avoiding you," he finally said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I'm just trying to figure out what's next." Emma stepped closer, her eyes softening as she regarded him. "I think you already know what comes next, Levi. But you're afraid. I can see it." Her words hit him like a slap, and Levi's chest tightened. He didn't want to admit it, but she was right. He was afraid of losing himself, afraid of losing her, afraid of letting go of the past that had shaped him into the man he was today. "I've been alone for a long time," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to share my life with someone. I don't know how to trust anyone anymore." Emma was silent for a moment, as if contemplating his words. Then she took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm not asking you to forget your past, Levi. I'm not asking you to erase the hurt and the loss. But you don't have to carry it alone. Not anymore." Levi felt his breath catch in his throat, his heart racing. He had spent so long convincing himself that he was better off alone, that the pain of losing his family and the life he had once known was something he had to carry by himself. But as Emma stood in front of him, her words cut through the fog of self-doubt and fear that had clouded his mind for so long. "I don't know if I can do this," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ground. "I don't know if I can trust myself to love again." Emma reached out, her hand gently lifting his chin so that he was forced to look at her. Her eyes were steady, unwavering, and for the first time, Levi felt like he could see the truth in them. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Levi," she said softly. "You just have to make a choice. And I'll be here, no matter what that choice is." The weight of her words settled over him like a blanket, warm and heavy. Levi's heart raced in his chest as he searched her face for any sign of doubt, any hesitation. But there was none. Emma was here, standing in front of him, offering him something he had never thought he would have again: hope. For the first time in years, Levi realized that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to let go of the past and start something new. Something that wasn't defined by loss or fear. something that was defined by the chance to love again. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he spoke. "I don't have all the answers," he said, his voice low but firm. "But I'm ready to try. To build something, even if it's just a start." Emma's face lit up with a smile, and Levi felt a rush of warmth spread through him. She had said she wasn't asking for much, but in that moment, Levi realized how much she had already given him. She had given him the courage to face the future. Together, they stood there, surrounded by the land that had defined them both, knowing that the choice had been made. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Levi didn't feel like he was walking it alone. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the prairie. But for Levi and Emma, it felt like the beginning of something new. The beginning of a life they would build together, one step at a time. The days after Levi's decision felt strange, as if the land itself was holding its breath. There was a calm in the air, but it wasn't the kind of calm that settled quietly. It was the kind of stillness that came before a storm, the kind that made you feel like something was about to change, whether you were ready for it or not. Levi spent his mornings, much the same as always, working hard, letting the routine of it all keep his mind occupied. But every time he walked into the cabin, he felt the weight of his choice, a choice he had made, not just for himself, but for Emma too. She was there, waiting, always waiting with that quiet strength that he had come to admire more than he would ever admit. It wasn't easy, though. It never was for Levi. The hardest part wasn't the work. The hardest part wasn't the long, cold nights where the wind howled outside. It wasn't the isolation. The hardest part was letting someone in, letting someone get close enough to see the broken parts of him that he had kept hidden for so long. And yet, here she was. Emma had slowly but surely found a way into his life. Not by force, not by pleading, but by simply being there. By quietly pushing him when he wanted to retreat, by giving him space when he needed it, but never ever letting him pull away for too long. The first time they sat down to share a meal together, Levi couldn't stop watching her. She was so different from the women he'd known, so full of life and warmth. She wasn't afraid to take up space, to speak her mind, to laugh like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Emma wasn't perfect, but to Levi, she was more than he had ever imagined. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" Emma said one evening, her voice breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them as they ate. "You don't talk much." Levi shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking to the fire that crackled softly in the corner. "Not much to say," he replied, shrugging. "I'm used to keeping things to myself." Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched him for a long moment, her eyes thoughtful. "You think you can keep it all inside forever?" she asked softly. "You think it won't catch up with you?" Levi hesitated, the question hanging in the air between them like a heavy weight. He had always believed that silence was easier, that it was safer. He had always thought that keeping his emotions hidden would protect him. But now, with Emma sitting across from him, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe it will. Maybe it won't." She smiled, the kind of smile that made his chest tighten. "You don't have to do it alone, Levi. Not anymore. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Those words, simple and steady, were the ones that changed everything. He hadn't realized it at the time, but in that moment, he felt something inside him break free. Something he hadn't even known was still locked away. The walls he had built around his heart, the ones that had kept him safe for so long, were finally starting to crumble. And it was Emma, with her quiet understanding and unwavering patience, who was the catalyst for it all. Days passed, and with each one, Levi found himself growing more and more comfortable with the idea of having someone by his side. He couldn't explain why, but Emma felt like home, like she belonged there, in his cabin, in his life. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping promises. It was about the small moments they shared together. The way she laughed when he said something funny, the way her hand felt in his when she reached for it, the way she simply existed in his world without asking for anything in return. One evening, as they stood together on a porch, Watching the sun dip behind the hills, Emma turned to Levi with a question he hadn't expected. "Levi, what are we doing?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. Levi didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure he had an answer. The truth was, he didn't know where this was going. He didn't know if he was ready for everything that came with it. But what he did know was that he didn't want to lose her. He didn't want to push her away again, like he had done with so many people before. "We're doing this," he said, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We're building something." Emma smiled softly, her hand slipping into his. "Together," she said, the word carrying more weight than Levi had ever imagined it could. For the first time in years, Levi felt like he was standing on solid ground. He wasn't alone anymore. He had someone by his side who saw him for who he really was, who accepted him for everything he had been and everything he was becoming. But just as he thought he could finally let his guard down, a knock on the door shattered the calm. Levi's heart skipped a beat as he looked at Emma, who was standing just a few feet away. Her expression shifted, her body tensing in a way that made Levi's instincts flare to life. He knew that knock. He knew the trouble it would bring. Levi moved toward the door, his boots heavy against the floor, and opened it slowly. Standing there, in the cold night air, was Sheriff Dent, flanked by two rough-looking men, their eyes glinting with malice. "Levi," Dent said, his voice flat but edged with menace. "You need to come with me. There's been talk. You know what I mean." Levi's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickening. He had known this day might come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. The town had always been quick to judge, quick to point fingers, and now it seemed they had found a new target. "Emma." "I'm not going anywhere," Levi said, his voice low and steady. "You can take your talk and keep it." Sheriff Dent's gaze flicked to Emma, who stood behind Levi, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You've made a mistake, Levi," Dent said, his voice rising with authority. "You're keeping that woman here, and there are folks who don't take kindly to strangers stirring trouble. She's got a past, and we got questions." Levi's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "She's not going anywhere," he repeated, his voice unwavering. "And neither am I." The morning after Sheriff Dent's visit, the air was heavy with the kind of silence that follows a hard-won decision. Levi stood on the porch of his cabin, his gaze sweeping over the familiar hills, the scattered trees, and the distant horizon where the sun was just beginning to rise. It was a new day, but the weight of the previous night's confrontation lingered like a storm that had passed, but left its mark. The town had come for Emma, their suspicions about her past fueling their judgment. But Levi had stood his ground. He wasn't about to let them take her. Not now, not ever. Inside, Emma was already awake. The soft clink of dishes and the steady hum of the fire in the hearth filled the cabin, a comforting rhythm that had become as familiar to Levi as the land itself. She was no longer just a stranger who had wandered into Sweet Vale. She had become a part of his world, woven into the fabric of his days. And as the town's threats loomed, he realized how much that meant to him. She was unexpected, a spark he hadn't seen coming. Yet she fit into his life in a way he couldn't have imagined. The knock had come, and they had faced it together. Sheriff Dent's words had carried the weight of the town's mistrust, a reminder of how quickly everything Levi had built could be torn down. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not after he'd opened his heart to her. Not after she'd shown him that he didn't have to face the world alone. Emma had become his reason to fight, to hold on to something more than the solitude he'd clung to for so long. As the sun climbed higher, Levi felt the stillness of the morning shift. Emma stepped out onto the porch, her presence as solid as the earth beneath them. Her dark hair was tied back loosely, her face soft from sleep, but etched with the same determination he'd come to rely on. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, met his, and he saw in them the quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the start. She wasn't the kind of woman to back down, not from fight, not from him, not from anything. "You ready?" she asked, her voice steady but carrying a trace of the weight they both felt. It wasn't fear, but an acknowledgement that they were about to face something bigger than themselves, something that would test the bond they'd forged. Levi nodded, his eyes locked on hers. As ready as I'll ever be. Emma's lips curved into a faint smile, one that held no humor but a shared understanding. She had always been the one to push him, to challenge him when he wanted to retreat into himself. Now, as the world around them grew uncertain, she was the anchor that kept him grounded. She had given him the courage to face his fears, and he was ready to stand by her side, no matter what came next. The sound of hooves crunching on snow broke the silence. Levi's heart skipped a beat. He knew what that meant. The town had returned, and this time, they weren't here to talk. They wanted Emma gone, their suspicions about her past outweighing any reason. Levi stepped forward, his boots heavy against the porch, positioning himself in front of Emma. Her hand found his arm, her fingers warm against his skin, a silent promise that they were in this together. The town was coming, just as Sheriff Dent had warned, and Levi wasn't about to let them take her. Not after everything they'd built, not after she'd shown him a life he hadn't thought possible. Over the ridge, the first figures appeared. Sheriff Dent rode at the front, his pale horse cutting through the snow with practiced ease. Behind him, a group of townspeople followed, men and women armed with pitchforks, rifles, and the weight of their collective judgment. Their faces were hard, their eyes fixed on the cabin as if it were a blight on their town. Levi felt the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, but he stood tall, his back straight, his heart steady. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. He wasn't going to let them tear apart what he and Emma had fought so hard to build. Emma stood beside him, her presence a quiet but unyielding force. Together, they stepped off the porch, meeting the townspeople in the yard just in front of the cabin. Sheriff Dent spoke first, his voice sharp with authority. "Levi," he called, reining in his horse. "You know why we're here. That woman's got no place in Sweet Vale. There's talk she's running from something. Debts, trouble, maybe worse. We don't take kindly to strangers bringing their problems here." Levi's gaze never wavered from the sheriff's face. He didn't flinch, didn't back down. He'd heard the whispers before, the quick judgments that came with living in a small town. But this time it was different. This time, he had someone worth protecting. "She's not your concern," Levi said, his voice low and steady. "She's with me now, and I'm not letting you take her." The crowd stirred, their murmurs growing louder, a mix of anger and unease. A burly man with a scar across his cheek stepped forward, his rifle gripped tightly, his face twisted with contempt. "You don't get to make that call, Boone," he spat. "This town's got rules, and she don't belong." Emma stepped forward, her chin raised, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I don't need to belong to you," she said, her voice cutting through the cold air like a whip. "I've done nothing wrong, and I'm not running from anything. If you've got accusations, bring proof. Otherwise, you're just chasing your own fears." Her words landed like a challenge, catching the crowd off guard. Levi glanced at her, a spark of pride igniting in his chest. She wasn't just standing her ground. She was claiming it, unafraid and unyielding. Sheriff Dent's hand rested on his gun, his eyes narrowing. "Proof or no proof, we don't trust outsiders. And you, Levi, you're making a mistake standing by her." Levi's hand moved to the revolver at his side, his fingers hovering but not drawing. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can come onto my land and tell me who I can stand by," he said, his voice like iron. "Emma's not going anywhere. Not today, not ever." The tension snapped like a brittle branch. The scar man raised his rifle, his face contorted with rage, but Levi was faster. In one swift motion, he drew his revolver and aimed it at the man's chest, his eyes cold and unyielding. The crowd froze, the air thick with the threat of violence. "Put it down," Levi said, his voice low but carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. "You don't want this fight." The scarred man hesitated, his eyes darting between Levi's steady aim and the sheriff, who stood motionless, his hand still on his own gun. The moment stretched, taut, and dangerous, until a new voice broke through. Enough! The town's preacher, an older man with a weathered face, pushed through the crowd, his hands raised in command. This ain't the way. You all know Levi Boone. He's a man of his word. If he says this woman's worth standing by, maybe we ought to give him the benefit of the doubt. The crowd shifted, some lowering their weapons, others muttering in reluctance. The preacher turned to Emma, his eyes softening. You got a story, don't you, miss? Emma met his gaze, unflinching. I've got a past, like anyone else, she said. But I'm not hiding from it. I came here to start over, and Levi's given me a reason to stay. The preacher nodded, then turned to the crowd. Ain't none of us without sin. Maybe it's time we stop looking for trouble where there ain't none. Sheriff Dent's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. The preacher's words, combined with Levi's unwavering resolve, seemed to shift the tide. One by one, the townspeople began to back away, their anger fading into uncertainty. Dent lingered a moment longer, his eyes locked on Levi, but the fire in his voice was gone. This better not come back to haunt us, he muttered, before turning and mounting his horse, signaling for the others to follow. As the crowd dispersed, Levi lowered his revolver, his heart still pounding. He turned to Emma, her face a mix of relief and fierce pride. You didn't have to do that, she said softly, her voice trembling just slightly. Yes, I did, Levi replied, his voice steady. You're worth it. Emma's eyes softened, and for a moment, they stood there, the weight of their victory settling over them like a warm blanket. They had faced the town together, and they had won, not just against the crowd, but against the doubts that had once held them back. In the weeks that followed, the whispers in Sweet Vale grew quieter. The town's suspicions about Emma faded, replaced by a grudging respect for the woman who had stood her ground beside Levi Boone. They worked side by side, building a life that felt more solid with each passing day. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Levi reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring, polished with care but bearing the marks of time. I ain't much for words, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I meant what I said. I want you here, Emma. Always. Emma's breath caught, her eyes glistening as she took the ring. I came here looking for something I didn't understand, she said, her voice soft but sure. I didn't expect you, Levi, but you're everything I needed. They married in the spring, under a sky as wide and open as the prairie, with the preacher's blessing and the town's reluctant acceptance. The wind still howled, but it carried no threats, only the promise of a life they'd built together, stronger than the land itself.